We're live.
Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the. Can you hear me? All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 30th Educational Leadership Forum, what we call ELF. I am Esolo Eyong Daniel, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator for today's session. I am thrilled to have all of you here as we gather for one of the forum's most anticipated moment, the workshop session. At every ELF event, the workshop is where ideas come alive, where learning becomes interactive, and where global educators, leaders, and change makers come together to shape meaningful action. Today is extra special because it marks the grand finale of the 30th ELF. And to close this inspiring journey, I think most of the people joining today had the chance to be there during the first and the second session that we had. We joined by an incredible thought leader, Professor Douglas Bourn, Professor of Development Education at University College London, UCL, facilitate a workshop titled A Pedagogy of Hope for Global Citizenship Education. This session is designed to spark meaningful conversation, to deepen our understanding, and empower us with the mindset, skills, and tools needed to move beyond theory and drive real world impact in our classrooms, community, and even beyond. Before we dive in, please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat box. We want to know your name, where you're joining us from, and maybe what you do in your everyday life. Thank you for being here. Your commitment to growth and professional development is truly inspiring, and a big shout out to every educator that is joining us from around the world. So, this morning, it is my pleasure to introduce today's expert speaker, Professor Douglas Bourn. Douglas Bourn is a professor of development education at UCL, University College London. From 2006 to 2024, he was director of the Development Education Research Center at UCL. He is the author of numerous books and articles related to the field of global learning, global citizenship, and education for sustainable development. These include Theory and Practice of Development Education, Understanding Global Skills, Education for Social Challenge, for Social Change, please. He has also edited numerous books in the field, including Bloomsbury Handbook of Global Education and Learning, Research in Global Learning, Pedagogy of Hope for Global Social Justice, and Education for Sustainable Futures. He was the chair of the Academic Network of Global Education and Learning, Angel, from 2017 to 2023. With that, let's give a warm welcome to Professor Douglas. The floor is now yours. Please clap.
you. Thank you, Danielle. Can you hear me okay? Yes, yes.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be with you here today. So it's a very exciting opportunity to share with people some of the writings and work I've been involved with over the past 20 years or so. And I'm really going to talk to you about where citizenship and global citizenship connect, particularly through this concept of a pedagogy of hope. And what I aim to do in my presentation is talk to you for about 30 minutes, and within 30 to 40 minutes, and within that there'll be a short cartoon video that I want to share with you to discuss some of the issues I think that are very relevant in a practical sense. I want to start by just posing some things I want to talk about. I want to talk quite a lot about this term global citizenship, and what it means to be a citizen and an active participant in today's globalized world. What does that mean? Also to recognize that there around the world there's lots of anxieties and concerns about the state of the planet, about increased wars and conflicts in several regions of the world, and the whole threat of climate change. So there's a sense about how do we address these concerns. And one of the ways that I'm suggesting we look at these areas is through this concept of pedagogy of hope, which I've taken from the great Brazilian educationalist Paulo Freire. And then I want to suggest that when we talk about global citizenship and the whole sense of who we are, what our role is in the world, how that links to a securing, more socially just world, and how that connects to education for social change. But I want to start by actually asking ourselves, what does it mean to be a citizen today? What, how do we see ourselves in our own societies and communities? And how does that relate to what's happening around the world? As we know that within many societies, there are people who are not recognized as citizens, who are deprived of their social and political rights. Not everyone has access to participate, to vote in elections in various countries around the world. So the sense of when we talk about citizenship, or when we talk about global citizenship, what does that mean? And is it a good term to use? I think it has value, but we also need to recognize that sometimes the term can be used in a very restricting way. And I want to, in recognizing that, I want to move on and suggest that in the context of the sort of globalized world that we're now living in, and this discussion online is an example of that globalized world we're now living in. What does it mean to be a citizen within all the ways in which we are interconnected? We all know the impact of of COVID and the global pandemic a few years ago, that demonstration showed us that we're no longer living in our isolated little bubbles anymore. We're all interconnected through a whole number of ways and forces. So the sense of how we see our identity and how that relates to what's happening in the globalized world is, I think, very important and significant in terms of today. Secondly, many societies today are becoming much more diverse, and there's much more movement of populations and peoples around the world. Some of that is for economic reasons, some of that is for political reasons, some of that is because of trying to escape poverty and oppression. Also, others are just looking for economic advancement and promotion. But that in itself, as we know, is causing tensions and conflicts in some places around the world. So we need to recognize these questions. But it also means that when we talk about citizenship and identity, what does that mean? Our economies, as we know, are much more global, that what's made and bought in one part of the world has been connected with something somewhere else in the world. Very often the supply chains, things go through 3 or 4 different countries for a product is actually completed. Also, we know that in many senses that a lot of the more invisible forms of within economies around finance and regulation all happen globally and done in an interconnected way. So, but there are all these things happening in the world today. So what does this mean for us as educationalists and those interested in education? And how does it help us look at who we are and how we see ourselves in the world today? So I would like to suggest and pose to you that within all these things and events and rapidly moving times, that the concept of global citizenship has some relevance. It's not the only term, it has some weaknesses, but it has some relevance because it helps us to think that we're part of something much bigger. Our sense of who we are and our sense of identity is connected to the globalized world. So if we recognize this thing, what is meant by being global? One of the things that might be useful for you to think about and ask you to do this in the chat, possibly, whilst I'm talking, is what does the global mean to you? What does it being part of some sort of globalized world? Or what does globalization mean to you? I often do often when I give a talk on this nature of my university, or give a workshop, I often say, well, do you think that the forces of globalization have been primarily a good thing or a bad thing? And it often depends upon where people have come from, where their country they've come from, their culture, their economy, the extent they're valued by being in connection to other places of the world. Others see it as that being global is meant the domination of the West, or in most cases, the domination of the United States culturally and economically. So there's a sense in which globalization can be seen both in a positive and negative way, and that has an impact upon how we see ourselves and what sort of form of identity we have. So that, I think, is worth thinking about when we talk about these questions. And so I've got two or three some quotations from well-known academics here who talked about what globalization has meant. And then often things that could be said is that globalization has meant that things are no longer stable, things are always changing. Also means there's movement of economies and jobs. The Australian academic Rizvi talks about dislocation from our traditional moorings. So the things that have rooted our culture and our societies have moved. We're no longer, in some cases, in control of those things. So what's been global has a important sense and impact upon how we see ourselves and what sort of form of identity and how we see our role in relation to the world. Harvey talks about cultural deterritorialization and time-space compression. These things are becoming much more compacted, things always moving around. There's not the same linear divisions that exist. Another term that I haven't got here that often people use is like porous borders. Things are always moving. The one academic Casals talks about network society, that things are much more connected. And he first raised this idea about 30 years ago when he talked about how global forces and technology would actually democratize access to information. Well, to some extent that's happened, but we also know there are power differentials within that. So when we talk about global in relation to citizenship, we have to pose some of these questions about how we see ourselves, what role, what identity we have, and how we respond to these areas. So if we recognize these things, how does this relate to societies that we're now living in? And how does it relate to how we see ourselves and our role in societies? So if we recognize that whatever society you're living in, vast majority have become much more complex and heterogeneous than they were 20, 30 years ago. Migration has resulted in partly some opportunities for increasing skills of the workforce and enriching cultures. It can also have some negative effects, and some people feel a sense of loss of identity as to who they are. This has particularly been the case within more westernized societies, which particularly in the global north, whether it's in the United States or in areas of Europe, where there's a sense in which, because of the nature of migration from the global south, the global north, for economic or social reasons, that has had impact upon how societies and economies have responded. And I think there's this sense about how we see ourselves in the world needs to be responded to that. That is why I think the concept of global citizenship is important, because it's a way of providing a positive way of moving forward that is valuable to see that societies are multicultural and diverse, but it also is valuable to see that we're all interconnected and part of a bigger globalized world. And that leads us to a sense of responsibility, how we see ourselves. But also recognize there are some negative consequences of that. which we need to recognize, not necessarily agree with, but need to understand. So, for example, in England a few years ago, a white working class teenage girl said in a multicultural classroom, "I'm from nowhere. I don't know who I am anymore." So there's such sense of understanding those things are very important for us as educationalists, because whatever our personal views, we need to understand where people are at, what their starting points are, and how we work with them in terms of moving forward. So to me, I therefore pose, that education has a critical role to play to both enabling people wherever they are living to understand the causes of the changing nature of societies and communities, to understand why there has been migration, to understand the different cultures and communities and what the value of that and how they can enrich societies. Also, we need to recognize that for many, particularly young people, they tend to see their engagement with what's happening in the wider world through social media and through online forms of activity. Now, that can be a way of engaging people and in learning about what's happening in the world, but it can also lead to a sense of isolation because your sense of engagement is in a very individualistic way. So to me, I think we need to recognize these things in terms of when we move forward. So if we recognize these things, what's been happening, particularly in the West in the last few years, has started to question and challenge some of these initiatives and what's been happening. So I would say that particularly the election of Donald Trump again as president of the United States and the rise of far-right parties in several countries around the world is presenting new challenges about how we respond to the global nature of the world in which we're living in. The sense of being a global citizen and to see the value of working in partnership with other countries and cultures is becoming to be challenged by some of these forces. And therefore we need to recognize how do we deal with these things as educationalists. At one level, it is almost giving a space for people with very far right views to say things that they tended to keep under the surface. Some people have said that's good because you know that we know far more about what their views are. But others might say, well, actually, should we allow even giving space to some of these viewpoints? So we need to recognize this is posing real challenges. But I would suggest even more important than that is a sense that in the past Second World War period throughout the world, there was this increased global consensus about the value of working together under the umbrella of the United Nations, and that's led to a whole range of global initiatives. There was the Millennium Development Goals in 2000, and in 2015, there were Sustainable Development Goals. And I should come back to that in a moment, which I think have been a very important framework for lots of the ideas and thinking that I've been raising. But I would like to pose to you that I think it might be very difficult to initiate a new Sustainable Development Goals today that will get a global, for which there'll be a global consensus. So in a sense that the ways in which societies and communities around the world are fractured as having an impact upon education. Because if you think about the value of global and what it means to be global citizens and to understand the wider world and engage that wider world, when you've got politicians and bodies in certain regions of the world just talking about we just got to protect our own interests, our own national identity, our own cultural identity, that presents real challenges, how we see ourselves as global. But I would argue we need to continue to remind ourselves about what these goals say and what initiatives like this promote. And I think these 17 goals, whilst they have some limitations, have provided a framework since 2015 for lots of the thinking and policy development in many regions of the world about addressing questions of hunger, climate change, gender equality, concerns about the environment, particularly on climate change, and the whole sense of how we can make all progress in these areas by working together. And there's one of the major things that have been based on that has, of course, been on climate change. But there has been, as I'm sure most of you are aware, there's been a breakdown in consensus on climate change around the world. And so there's some of those challenges are now we need to be conscious of. But within the Sustainable Development Goals, I particularly wanted to mention this. And I think this what's called Target 4.7, Target 4.7 is part of the Quality Education framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, talks about that by 2030, all learners acquire the knowledge and skills to promote sustainable development, including making reference to human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversities. Now, this target has been raised in a number of countries and regions around the world as providing an important framework for some of the things that I've just been talking about. That if you want to see ourselves, what's our role as citizens, what to see our role as global citizens, then there needs to be some sense of values-based, some sense of common goals that we're working towards. And I would see these questions about rights and equality and peace and recognizing diversities in societies and communities being a very important part for promotion of the overall goal of working towards 2030 around sustainable development. Now, here we are 2/3 the way through that 15-year period. The evidence is some areas of progress, but in the main, nowhere near as much as people had hoped. And I think there may be many reasons for that, but I think we need to recognize and understand that this target is, I still argue, a very key one. So what does this all mean today? So does it mean being global today? Does globalization mean homogenization, or could it mean opening up to ideas and range of voices? Does it mean acceptance of working with the forces of globalization, or could it mean the opposition in terms of challenging global bodies? There are different ways that you can interpret what it means to being global. I don't have, as an educationalist, my role is just to pose those questions. To what extent does it mean that in terms of who we are and our role and how we can learn more about the wider world? How do we see our relationship to that? Do we see it just as a way of just absorbing and learning about somewhere else? Or do we see it much more as how we can participate and work together with other communities and peoples around the world to address climate change, to address the inequalities that exist in the world, and to secure a more peace and socially just world? So those are the sort of conversations that I'm particularly interested in encouraging within all forms of education. How do we see our relationship to the world? How can we ensure that we learn more about the wider world? And how do we do that? So that's why I see the value of this term global citizenship, because it can promote a sense of being part of a worldwide community, that we have some sense of shared responsibility as to who we are and what we do. And also being a global citizen is someone who is aware of global issues, but is more than that. They respect the diversities that exist in the world, also understands that we're interconnected, and that we also work together to contribute to more just, peaceful and equitable world. And that we do that in ethically way, in a socially responsible way. And that these are big challenges, of course, and not something you can just say, I mean, this is what I'm going to do and this is how I'm going to act. But to me, these are sorts of aspirations that we should be working towards, and which I would see as being very much part of the sort of ways in which I would see our role as educators. So this term global citizenship in relation to education has been increasingly accepted by a number of international bodies, most notably UNESCO, which is the UN body for education, science, and cultural understanding. And they see that global citizenship education plays an important role in promoting solidarity and empowering people to make impact in their communities, both locally and globally. Now, I think the important word here is solidarity. At a time in which there's increased factions between communities around the world, a increased return to a sense of almost xenophobia and isolationism, a sense of promoting solidarity, that there's more value in working in partnership with others, can be a way of making a more just and better world. So to me, I think what UNESCO are promoting, have been posing for over a decade or so, is very important. Unfortunately, it doesn't always get listened to in the way it should do, but I would argue and suggest to all of you that some of the work that UNESCO have done around global citizenship education is worth considering. I want to use this quotation about being global citizens. This is from two Canadian academics, and I think it brings together some of the things I've been saying about citizenship and identity in a way that recognizes the value of diversity, but also a sense of common humanity. And if you just look at this quotation, it starts by saying that we share a sense of common humanity with others. We have many things in common, and hopefully we're working together to the value of working together. But at the same time, we recognize that there's great diversity in the world, but this diversity can be enriching and ensure improving the quality of life for all. Thirdly, it's about recognizing the rights and responsibilities we have, that they have both local and national and also global implications. Being an active citizen, it's not just something you just do in your community, it has global responsibilities. And that means that seeing global citizens means that it's much about seeing the connection between the local and the global as it is about what's happening elsewhere in the world. To me, being a global citizen can be someone who's very active in the local community, but is doing so in a way around themes and issues that can enrich communities, that promotes a values base around humanity, that's concerned with protecting the environment, and wants to work towards greater equality. And that means that being a global citizen, you have to be involved and be able to participate. You have a sense of responsibility. And that means that if you recognize that diversity is valuable, and that it's valuable to have different perspectives, and that this can enable us to have greater dialogue, to learn from each other, possibly to question our own assumptions, and to listen to a range of voices and perspectives. And that could be on issues very specific to a very specific cultural question. It may be in relation to how we relate to issues, how we see things. But by having those perspectives, that can enable us to take action for the common good that has both local and global consequences. So what do these all mean for education? So when we pose all these things, how do we see ourselves and how do we relate this role of education? When I was first starting to work on my book on education for social change a few years ago, I started in the UK to go around a number of schools and talk to a number of teachers about how they see the role of education to inspire and enthuse their pupils to a secure and more just world. One of the things I noticed going to a number of schools, but there were often large displays or quotations of famous people as you walked into a school on the sort of foyer. They were there deliberately to inspire the pupils and the teachers to believe that that education is powerful and valuable. And these three quotations, one from Malala, she talks about how you can change the world. Nelson Mandela's quote about education is the most powerful weapon to change the world. And Kofi Annan, former Secretary General of the United Nations, talked about the power of knowledge and that education is a premise of progress. There's the sense about how we can encourage and enthuse people we are teaching or where our role as educators to inspire and enthuse people, right? And that to me is very important. But that poses questions that we feel confident and positive in the state of the world, that we feel we can do that. And as we know, there are many countries around the world at the moment, because of what's been happening about climate change or increased war and conflicts, that many, particularly young people, are very anxious and concerned about the state of the world. And this summary of recent research shows some of that. But what is interesting is that a lot of that anxiety is also about anger. It's a sense of feeling ignored, of feeling how do we have a voice in what's happening around the world, and how can we ensure that we can contribute to what's happening in the world. And that to me is something I think we need to think about. And that's why I pose that it's about moving from anger to action. But actually it's about understanding those concerns, to understand why particularly young people are very anxious about the world, how they feel they can't contribute, what they can do to make a difference. And that's why I want to start to pose to you all the way we address these concerns, the way we address these desires to engage in the world but feeling very anxious and perhaps isolated, to recognize and understand that there are various international initiatives around these areas and that we need to understand what they're about. And there could be ways of enthusing and working with our peers and people we work with. Now, this quotation, which is called the Dublin Declaration, which is done by a group of governments and policymakers in Europe, talks about global citizenship education, talks about enabling people to reflect critically on the world and their place in it, to how they see themselves, to open their minds and their hearts to what's happening in the world, and to empower them to feel they can make a difference, to have a sense of hope that they can make a difference. And I think it recognizes that it has some value in all corners and regions of the world. And that leads on to what I want to conclude with, and before I show this short video, is the sort of theories and ideas that inform my sense of looking at this. And the person who's particularly influenced my thinking on this is the Brazilian educationist Paulo Freire, who talks about a liberatory approach to education, to engage with seeing that education is a political act, that is about how we can understand the world in which we live and to consciously address the questions. And that leads on to what I talk about, which is a pedagogy of hope. And that is to address the concerns and anxieties we may have. We have as educationalists concerned about education to promote a positive, forward-looking, forward-thinking approach to engaging with the world. We can't be a good educator if we're a negative educator. We won't be able to enthuse and inspire others if we just go on saying it's all depressing and difficult. We have to give a sense of optimism that change is possible. But we do that not some idealistic way, but locating the issues in the experiences of what's happening in the world. To recognize we need to understand the complexities of the issues in the world. And also to recognize that we understand why some people might feel hopeless and how they can go beyond just emotional response to develop what we would call an educated hope, and that change is possible. So to me, this concept of an educated hope is where I see a lot of the ways forward in which we're thinking about. And I'm particularly inspired by the American political activist Henry Giroux, who develops this concept of critical pedagogy, the sense of understanding the context in which we're learning to move beyond emotional responses. So if we see this sense of hope as being very much part of how we see things as citizens, how we wish to engage in the world, how do we do that? How do we promote and inspire people to do these questions? And that's why I want now to show you this technology works, this video. Let's get rid of this. What I'm going to be showing you is a video from Vietnam.
Switching to Vodafone
That will
full
show
and it is
you
as
about
easy
how
as that.
groups of people
One touch switch.
are addressing these questions.
Planet Earth is perfect for life. It's the perfect distance from the sun, and so the perfect temperature. It has all the ingredients for life. Everything is perfectly balanced to maintain a thriving planet. But climate change is tipping that balance. There are more extreme conditions, more unpredictability.
Professor Douglas?
Yes, hold on. You're not getting it.
We're hearing it, but we're not seeing it.
Okay, right.
So I think you have to change tabs in order for us to be able to see the video, please.
Right. So I need to come. Okay. Let me try that again. Still not on.
Would you? I can copy the link and do it. Just give me a few seconds, please.
Sorry about this. I can also just send people the link and they can watch it in their own time. The other option.
Professor Douglas, I am just trying to copy the link and do it from my end, if that's okay with you. I just need a few seconds, please.
Okay, that's fine. Okay. So whilst you're doing that, just to say a little bit of context about this video, and that it's an example of a story about how community in Vietnam responds to the challenges they have about the environment and climate change, and how it can be a way of enthusing, inspiring their community to become active in these issues about sustainability issues and global issues. So that's the purpose of the video. And I think that's what I hope you will be able to see. If not, if you get the connection, the link, I think that will be fine. Okay, just hold on a second.
All right.
So do I need to come out of stop sharing or not?
It would automatically log you, cut your presentation once I open on this side. So I think you're okay. All right. Sorry, everyone. Just a few seconds and we're there. Okay. Perfect. Can I have thumbs up?
Sorry. Shall I stop sharing? Yes.
In case you can see my screen.
Stop sharing.
Yes. Can you see my screen?
I can't at the moment, but I don't know if anyone else. Ah, yes, yes. Okay. Just play that now. Yeah.
All right, now that Professor Douglas can see it, can I have thumbs up from everyone as well, just to confirm that we can, all right. Okay, we have, all right, so now everybody can see it. Thank you so much for your patience.
Planet Earth is perfect for life. It is the perfect distance from the sun, and so the perfect temperature. It has all the ingredients for life. Everything is perfectly balanced to maintain a thriving planet. But climate change is tipping that balance. There are more extreme conditions, more unpredictability. There are problems that feel overwhelming. Are you feeling powerless? Are you feeling like nothing can be done? Well, take a trip down the Red River. Follow me. The Red River flows through Vietnam. There's a project running here that inspires young people to listen to stories of their towns and villages. The young people listen and record. They collect stories of fishing and traveling on boats, of storms, flash floods, and landslides, of families, of things changing and things staying the same. Hundreds of stories that flow like the river around them. There were stories of extremes, too little water in the dry season and too much when it rained. There was a story of how the cardamom that families had relied on to sell was no longer growing in the forest due to more extreme weather. There was a story about a mother who, when her husband died, had her land taken away from her. There was the story of a terrible flood that washed away houses, food, and livelihoods. Now, the strange thing about listening to stories is that a story is like a seed. When it is told to you, it's planted. But that is not the end of its life. The stories grew inside the young people. They made them ask questions. They made them talk. They made them explore and wonder. And the more they heard, the more they began to see that there was hope where before they could see none. Upstream, the people in the flood had not given in. They had joined hands and worked together, getting things up high and taking care of each other. Villagers had started to grow bamboo to stop the banks of the river eroding. They grew tea to protect them from flooding and create a new income. The young people went to the authorities and a story about the single mother whose husband had died, and she was given more assistance. The young people didn't want these stories of disaster and hope to be ignored. They didn't want them to get washed away in the floods or broken apart by the wind. They wanted to turn the stories into something. A young woman listened to the stories and turned them into a comic strip about a dragonfly who predicted the rain by flying low. Not everyone heeded the dragonfly's warning, but those who lost their crops were helped by others who had collected their harvest early.
Mhm.
A young man took out his phone and started to make a film about the mangrove forest. Trees had been dying as rising sea levels meant an increase in salt water further up the river. He filmed the community-based mangrove protection groups and the action the government was taking. The young people shared the stories they had collected with an indigenous water puppetry troupe who had been part of a long tradition of telling stories about life along the river. The water puppetry troupe then began to wonder if they could use their performances in a different way. The flipbooks, drawings, podcasts, films, puppet shows, and presentations that the young people made did something to the stories. They made the stories stronger. These weren't films and books and poems made by people far away, from places no one had ever been to. They were stories made here, right at home. And because of that, the young people saw that they could change their endings. They could act. The young people kept going, working independently, and keeping the project alive. The stories had been brought to life. Listening, recording, turning stories into something, sharing, and taking action had become a kind of process. The young people found they could adapt to how the climate was changing. They found a way to talk about it.
to not be frightened into inaction, to communicate, connect, adapt, hold hands, and work together. The project had worked. It had made a change, and it continues. Goodbye and good luck.
Thanks, Danielle. That's great. Thank you. Okay. Right, I'll start sharing again. Okay, so I think what I wanted to conclude, thank you for that, and sorry for the technology problems we had there from that, is that what I wanted to do in bringing this together, sorry, let me just find the slide I want to get to, is that the sense, what's important there was the sense of hope, the sense they feel they can make a difference. And I think that was, to me, what's important here, about how the community engaged with these issues. And therefore, it wasn't just something they did on their own, it's something they did together and feel they can make a difference. So therefore, when I talk about global citizenship education, I talk about a pedagogy of hope. It's not some idealistic dream, but it's about engaging with the issues, seeing the challenges we face and what you can do together to make a world a better place. But also identifies the potential power and value that education can play in this process as a way of motivating, engaging learners to do so in a way when we connect that back to a sense of citizenship and a sense of global citizenship. So to me, it's about sharing, providing spaces for where we see these issues, that people feel they can engage, to listen to the various views there are about these issues, to understand these questions and what we can do to act. And this context is talked in relation to climate change, but it could also be seen more broadly and more widely. So I've addressed some of these questions in this book that I edited a few years ago. That's a book that's available to download for free from Bloomsbury Publishing. And we're bringing together a range of voices and perspectives that address these issues. And I'll also address them in a book that I produced a few years ago that I'm just about to publish a second edition on, called Education for Social Change. And that's the sense about talking about a pedagogy of global social justice, that we can work together, and that to pose the question that teachers can see themselves as agents of change. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and look forward to any questions or comments you may have to have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Doug, for such an insightful session, honestly. And I think one key takeaway for me was, at some point you talked to us about the rights and responsibilities of citizenship that we can do at the local level, but that has an impact globally. And for me, honestly, it stood out because sometimes we think that we have to start big, whereas we actually need to start from where we are with the tools that we have in order to impact change globally. Now it's time for our interactive Q&A. So this is your opportunity to ask any questions that you have or share your thoughts in regards to the conversation that we're having here today. So please kindly drop your question in the chat, and we get to as many as possible. So if you have any questions, please drop it in the chat, and we can have one or two people. If you'd like, you can turn your mic on and ask your questions. We're waiting for the questions.
Whilst people are waiting, if I could ask, as the questions just come in, okay, what are the top 3 things educators should start if they are to foster a pedagogy of hope? Thanks, Arian. I think the first thing is I would say to start is to recognize and understanding the challenges that that we're all facing the world and that learners are facing in terms of addressing these issues that we've just been talking about. First of all, we need to understand where learners are at, to understand what could potentially be the starting points for their engagement and their discussion, what that might look like. Secondly, to have some sense of understanding yourself as an educator and what is your approach to learning, what is your ways in which you engage learners in understanding these issues to have a sense of hope. And would you start with some form of video I just showed you, or would you start with some form of direct activity you can do together? I think to show the value of what you can do together. I think to me there's got to be a connection between some just learning about somewhere than actually being involved in doing something, right? And I think that learning process has to be an active one. The third thing I would say is the sense of the value that by working together in a collective sense, that actually you can secure meaningful change that can make the world a better place. So it's about recognizing, it's about understanding where the starting points are, where people might engage in these issues, and then also what people might do with those issues. So to me, there are dangers sometimes when people talk about hope there's somewhere way up here. It's too idealistic. It doesn't relate to where I am. I'm feeling someone could be very negative or very critical about what's happening in the world. The starting point is to understand why they're feeling like that. What are the issues they're concerned about? So for many young people, the sense about if climate change is very important to them, what do they do with that? Why can you turn that concern to some sense of energy and forms of engagement? Okay, I see a second question there. What can educators do to cultivate and to sustain their own hope? And how does that personal practice then translate into inspiring hope in students? And I think you can, some of that comes through your forms of action, what you do by providing some sense of leadership. Secondly, I think, as I said, that you, as an educator, you have to promote a sense of optimism and change if possible, of enthusing learners, the value of learning, that learning can help to contribute to these areas. And I would also say that some of these things can often be best done by showing stories or examples of practice, like the one I've shown you today. And also that you sustain that by seeing that this is not just some one-off thing that you do on activity. There's got to be something much more broader that has longer term impact. And I think that's where I think some of the challenges there might be for when we talk about some of these issues, that all too often someone said, oh yes, I do this project that promotes a sense of hope, and they do that and then they move on to something else, right? In my own country, I'm working with a community organisation in London that's got this project called Communities of Hope, which is about engaging schools and communities around various sustainable issues. Their big challenge is what happens at the end of their project funding for their project, 2 years' time. How do they sustain that? And that's about how do you build, it's not just about learning, about how do you build that process into what we're trying to do. Okay, what is your hope for global global citizenship education? I think it's my response to that would be that there have been times over the past 30, 40 years around the world where there have been times of positive development and interest in these fields, and there have been times where there hasn't been because of what's happening in the world or particular regions in the world. To some, it may appear that at the moment those things might be quite difficult, but my response to that is to say that from my experience, particularly talking to lots of teachers and also talking to a lot of young people, that they're the ones that are driving and wanting to learn more about the wider world and want to engage in the issues that I've just been talking about. So to me, the hope is in the practice of the educators. And what we have to do is ensure that the educators retain this sense of hope and optimism. And from Samuel, as educators, how can we assess the hope factor? Or is it more about observing behavior changes? I'm not a great believer in sort of assessing behavior change as such, because I think there are potential dangers with that, and that somehow by some form of input of some knowledge or activity, that therefore automatically changes people. I would see much more a sense of promoting a culture within a community, within an education environment that demonstrates the value of promoting this approach. So we assess that by the extent to which the learners remain engaged and enthusiastic about these issues, that they feel that they are important. And that, to me, is how I would do that. And that, so you may maybe need to assess a particular area of learning. What do they know about climate change or gender equality or peace? But actually, it's the extent to which this enthuses people, that they engage and that their learning is seen to be relevant. Because in my experience, all too often, a lot of learning that takes place in schools or even in colleges, universities, there's a sense that it's often done in a very abstract way, something distant and far away. And I think that, to me, what's important is that what we're trying to do through this process of a pedagogy of hope is to promote a process of learning that connects with people's everyday experiences. And as Danielle was mentioned about, the local is equally important as the global. And that, to me, is where I would see things being very important. And I think I take your point, Danielle, about sense of people's sense of identity and who they are. And I think that's a real challenge today, as society is becoming ever movable. There's also a danger of fossilizing a culture in a particular area, that what it might have been like 50 or 100 years ago, and not recognizing the value of things are constantly changing. And I think the sense of how we do that in a way within societies, communities, particularly between generations, which, as you've mentioned, is, I think, a challenge. And I think one of the ways you do that is actually demonstrating the value to all generations of what the value of what that learning can provide. And I actually think that some of the big global issues, the sense of rise of xenophobia, I think is that it will be young people that will challenge that, particularly in many societies and communities. It will them that would demonstrate the value of interconnectedness, the value of learning about other issues. But obviously also at the same time, trying to celebrate their own cultural identities. I'm not saying these are easy, but to me, that's where the role of education comes in, because the role of education is to pose these questions, not to say these are the something, is this one solution. I noticed a comment from Mohammed about particular students from underprivileged backgrounds. who don't see themselves as connected to the global space. I take that. I think that's a very important comment, because I think there are certain assumptions made in many societies and countries that everyone is connected around the world, that everyone has these opportunities to engage in these issues. There's been some quite interesting literature that the term global citizenship, being a global citizen, is a term for the privileged Western elite who can travel and communicate and have access to things. I think there's some truth in that argument, and that's often how that's been perceived and used. And I think you address these things for people from, particularly young people from underprivileged backgrounds, is by engaging them with the issues that concern them and starting from their local questions. And I think the River of Hope story is an example of that, the ways in which you can then make connections to others elsewhere in the world. And I think but you recognize that this question of time. And I think there is a sense that there are dangers that you could promote the global in a way that could be seen as being beyond a lot of people's reach and forms of engagement, because connecting with other cultures, communities, having more global outlook can often be unsettling and can often be questioning your own sense of who you are and your sense of identity. And I would say that as an educator, you've got to be prepared and equipped to address those challenges.
All right. Okay, there is another question that came in, Professor.
Yes. Okay. From Merrill. In a world where so many people are facing challenging social circumstances, how do you instill the idea of global citizenship with this idea? Yes. And I think my response to that is to say that being global, we're not talking about being global, but recognizing that some of the issues that exist in the world and some of the challenges could actually be addressed by being connected with groups and economies and communities elsewhere in the world. The sense that it can actually enrich and support people and what they're doing by connecting with people elsewhere. I accept that these things, it can often appear to be very abstract and way out there, but my response to that is to say that being a global citizenship education is about a process of learning about how you make connections of what's happening to people's immediate concerns to what's happening in the wider world. And questions climate change is an obvious example of that. We're not going to address the challenges of climate change by just focusing this solely on our community. We have to see it in a global context. But I recognize that for many young people, many communities around the world, some of those processes take time. They require resources to enable that to happen. But it also requires that possibilities for opportunities, professional development of teachers and educators, so they can engage these questions, because these things are not easy. What I've outlined is not something you can just suddenly do tomorrow. It's not a quick fix solution. It's a mindset change. It's about how you see the world and how we can engage in those questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor. I think this was the last question, so we're going to round up the session. Thank you all for your participation and your questions. Honestly, as Professor Douglas was answering them, I was like, oh yeah, this is a point that I would have loved to talk about as well. So thank you all. The more we ask questions, the better understanding we have of the issue at hand of what we can actually do. So a special thank you to you. And to you, Professor Douglas, for making the time to be here with us, for sharing your wisdom, your expertise, and your practical insights with us today. So we hope that this session has left everyone here feeling inspired and has somehow equipped you with actionable strategies on rethinking civics and citizenship education in your classroom and in the world as a whole. So before we wrap up, let's stay connected. Join us on LinkedIn. We have a community on LinkedIn, and visit our webpage to continue the conversation and explore more growth opportunities. Please do follow Professor Douglas on LinkedIn as well. And if you have any questions, please reach out to him. If he spoke about, I think we shared like books, and we shared some articles. If you want to know where to get them, please reach out to him directly, as he can make that available. And this is just a reminder as well that we have our international conference coming up in November. In case you would like to join the conversation and be part of it, please do follow us on our LinkedIn. Thank you so much. Have an amazing day, everyone. Stay inspired, stay curious, and keep inspiring the world for human and planetary flourishing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to meet everyone.
Goodbye, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.